actually going to begin our time with a question from our people watching on the internet. Actually, going back to yesterday, Dr. Bryant-Davis, this person says, yesterday you mentioned mindful intimacy, so important. How can we practically help clients and our students and everyone ease into some kind of practice, keeping in mind the religious and cultural boundaries that need to be kept?
Excellent. So for those who weren't here yesterday, we were talking about mindfulness is being present in the moment on purpose without judgment and with self-compassion. And it's also being tuned in to your feelings, your needs, what you're seeing, really sacred presence. And so we talked about different forms of mindfulness. And one of the forms I talked about is mindful intimacy, and how a lot of times we are not equipped to work with people around sexuality. And so with our discomfort, we avoid the topic. And a lot of people are really struggling. And it is difficult for them being present with their partners because they are checked out for various reasons. Sometimes people are checked out, I'll link it to today, because of trauma. And so they are being triggered. And so in the instance of intimacy, in order to quote unquote get through it, they have to blank out. Or some people, talk about social scripts, are approaching intimacy as performance, which is not really presence, right? It is performance, as you were sharing. If we were moving out of ego, I'm trying to get a response from you, but I'm not really present. And then another piece which is important to address is some people have addictions with pornography. And so, what pornography trains you to is to objectify and not have to respond to a living person, right? So I like the hips from this one. I like the lips from this one. I like how this one does this. And I can, now it's not turn the page. Now I can click back and forth to get what I want to see. And then that trains me, it trains my arousal and my release in a particular way. But now when I am with an actual living person who has thoughts, feelings, needs, wants, it will throw off my narrative or my fantasy, right? So in terms of some practical things to do around mindful intimacy, again, I'll tie it in today to today's topic of trauma. And that is sometimes a simple intervention is to have people turn a light on, right? Doesn't have to be blaring lights, but if you are a trauma survivor and you are in the dark, you are much more likely to be triggered from past experiences of violation because you can't see who you are with. Not only turn on a light, open your eyes. Open your eyes and have your partner speak to you. It grounds you in the present. So instead of me thinking about what happened in 8th grade, instead of me thinking about what the bus driver did, what the stepfather did, then I see you and I stay present with your eyes and with your voice. It also is important practically to get a sense of knowing what your triggers are so that you can communicate that to your partner because, people can't read our minds. And so sometimes there may be particular, if someone comes up to you from behind, that can be very triggering, right? Or a particular thing that an offender did or a certain way that they spoke, instead of just struggling through it, to take the risk of vulnerability and speaking about our feelings, our needs, and our wants. Another important piece for couples is it not being all or nothing. As intimacy is more, and I'll talk plain because we're here to talk plain, intimacy is more than penetration. Yes? So helping people to talk about, God designed these bodies, and these bodies are designed for a pleasurable response, right? The devil didn't make that. The devil did not make your body do that, right? So this is a sacred, beautiful thing. And so empowering people, giving people permission to be present and know that that's a gift. It's a sacred gift. So the thing I will just say to end my answer is our physical bodies and sexuality are a beautiful gift that can be misused, but when people have misused it, to not let that define it, right? So people have used it as a tool to erase you, to hurt you, to manipulate you, but that is not the totality of what it is.
As sort of a clinician myself, I just wanted to jump off that and say, because you said something really powerful yesterday, or at least I inferred it, maybe I heard what I wanted to hear, that when we as the clinicians are uncomfortable with our own sexuality, whether that's trauma or it's just the theological training maybe we've come up with, that we miss opportunities in the session. We create spaces where clients can't talk about their sexuality. So we need to do our work maybe on the couch and in spiritual disciplines and in community so we can become comfortable with our sexuality in order to be able to talk to clients about it.
Absolutely. And I should tell you, trauma survivors are very good at reading people. Like we've had to survive. So it doesn't matter what you're saying. We read facial expression and body language. So when your clients pick up on you're uncomfortable, they will backtrack out of there and talk about things you like to talk about. So now like you're directing their therapy based on your comfort.
Do you see any times when it's good to encourage a trauma survivor to disconnect from a community where there's low social support?
Absolutely. And before I give that answer, I want to acknowledge something I didn't acknowledge at the end of my talk, and that is I appreciate all the survivors who broke silence. I appreciate you. I appreciate you. And it's a beautiful thing to see your hands raised, to see you standing, owning your story, owning your truth, and claiming yourselves. So thank you for that. In terms of needing to disconnect, this has to be, first of all, the client's decision, because then when we talk about this issue of like culture, right, about culture and faith, we have to interrogate for ourselves what works for us, right? And so there are some people who are a detriment to your mental health. And one of the gifts you can give yourself is to stop being surprised by people who are acting like who they are, right? So it's like every Thanksgiving, they're going to make you cry. Every Christmas, you're going to go over there and then they're going to talk about your weight and talk about why you're still single or talk about how you're not this or not that. And then we want to be shocked. Like, I can't believe she said that to me. You really can't believe it? Right? She's been saying that to you your whole life, right? So then once I know who I'm dealing with, I have to make decisions about how I want to engage with that. And so there are some people who their culture or their theology won't let them cut people off. Then what I say to them is, then you can think about giving yourself permission to reduce your time, right? If you only have a 2-week vacation, are you going to really spend all 2 weeks being traumatized? So now for another year, you got to heal from the new things they did? So you may feel the need to at Easter, I have to go over there. Okay, then how long do you have to stay? And also sometimes you might want to sit at the kids' table, right? Or you might want to run errands. Whenever they need an errand, you're like, who needs me to go get something? All right, I'm out of here. Get in the kitchen. I'm chopping. I can't hear y'all. I'm chopping, right? So you have to figure out how to make it work for you. And if it really doesn't work for you, to know that some people you have to love from a distance. And while we talk about, God told me to honor people, we have to also know that God says that we are temples, right? That this is not a one-sided, we are not the Messiah, right? And so if someone is stabbing you in your back as you're trying to honor them, then I might need to honor you from my house, right? I'm honoring you from over here, and I can give you all the honor I can give from over here. And but I do want to just caution the clinicians, you have to let people explore and figure out what works for them, because it's not for us to mandate you don't need to go there or you don't need to speak to them.
Great. We're going to take your question. And then I do want to go back because Dr. Crouch raised some questions, and I want to see if you have a response to that. Yes, please.
First, I just want to say, Dr. Bryant-Davis, every time I hear you speak and I'm in your presence, I'm enlivened by your enlivenedness. Like, seriously, it's just, you bring everything out of me that just represents who I am by just witnessing you be yourself. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And so I love that one, so much of what you said I really valued and appreciated, but the one piece around moving from that we aren't born just to be healing from trauma, but to move into our own purpose as persons. Can you speak more to that in terms of collective purpose? Because some of the work I do specifically around internalized oppression, helping African descendant people heal from the impact of white supremacy domination, oftentimes we'll get caught up in those war stories of, let me tell you about one other thing a white person has done to me. Let me tell you about another microaggression I experienced. And then our identities are tied and connected to in response to whiteness or white people's atrocities in response to us, as opposed to our collective purpose as a people. Can you speak to that?
Yes, absolutely. I love it. Love the work that you're doing. And one of the important things for us to be aware of is race does not equal racism. Culture does not equal cultural oppression. So what that means is those things exist, but they are not the sum total of our identity, right? So, for example, if you have a women's center, I don't know if you do have a women's center on your campus? No? Yes? No? Okay. So campuses that have a women's center, they don't have every program talking about sexism, right? Not every program on the list is talking about patriarchy. That's going to be some of the programming, but there are some things just about womanhood that are about womanhood, right? And so it is the same thing in terms of our trauma identity is what I say. The trauma affected me, but it doesn't define me. So it is a part of my story. It did have an impact, but there is a me that those moments have nothing to do with, right? And so when we think about that from a post-traumatic growth, it's where we're talking about thriving, right? And so one of the things we want to be careful about is giving people space that we can hold both. And what I mean by that is people who are uncomfortable dealing with oppression and trauma will want people to skip to the purpose, right? Because they really don't want to hear it. Like, don't tell me about your rape, tell me about your dreams, right? Because they're not ready to hear the rape, yes? So we need to create space where we can tell those stories, the narratives of wounds and oppression and discrimination. And we can also talk about the richness and wealth and the resilience and the cultural resources that we carry, that we have a lot to celebrate and a lot that is envied around the world, right? That people come and come for our stuff because it's so amazing. So being able to help people to hold both, and also I would say from a spiritual perspective that some of this stuff is designed to distract us from our power, to distract us and talk us out of our gifts and purpose, spiritually, culturally, personally. And so it is important to make room for the fullness of who you are and who we are. Thank you.
So can I take
Yes, I saw. I was trying to make sure I had it all or had most of it. So thank you both so much. Weren't they wonderful? That was great. So the first thing that stood out to me was this issue of the our fault. And the piece about our fault, I can tell you, victim blaming, even when we are blaming ourselves, psychologically, it is grounded in a desire for control. So if I can believe that I can dictate the outcome, that feels better, right? Which is why some people would say, well, that happened to her because she went over his house, and I would never go to his house. That happened to her because she wore that outfit. And I'm very holy, and I don't wear things like that, so it'll never happen to me, right? So we have a lot of the blaming, even when we blame ourselves, it is if I can figure out what I did wrong, then I'll never do that again, and then I'll be safe, right? That is what's underneath that. So in social psychology, we call it belief in a just world. So people like to believe it is a just world, and in a just world, good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people, right? So if something bad happened to you, let's figure out what you did, right? Because that's why it happened. And so it is a worldview shift to take in the reality that you can be a good person minding your business and terrible things can happen to you. And that even if you're not a perfect person, you did not deserve that treatment. And so one of the balancing acts we try to do with clients, which you can only do when you really have rapport and you communicate very clearly with them, is the difference between risk reduction and prevention. Okay? So risk reduction are things that victims can do to try to reduce the likelihood of something happening. But prevention can only be done by potential offenders because they did it or they didn't do it. So let me just give an example of that around sexual assault. If you met someone on an app and you met them for the first time and you went to their apartment and they assaulted you, right? You could say, I can try to reduce my risk by not going to the homes of people I don't know. But even though you went to their home, does not give them the right to violate you. So it's when we say the distinction, even if I want to say I maybe had quote unquote poor judgment shouldn't be a rapeable offense, right? So that's the piece about our fault. And then I'll just say in psychology, we have locus of control. And so there's internal locus of control or external locus of control. And we generally say it's healthier if you have an internal locus of control, which of course is Western also, but the idea that like I can make things happen, right? As opposed to the world around me shapes my reality. And so when our locus of control shapes how we make meaning, but the truth is we are bidirectional. I am impacting my environment and my environment is impacting me. I'll try to move on. Sorry. Okay. Then I wanted to appreciate your transparency about telling the stories about getting it wrong. And it's important to name it because, and also for those of us who are professors to name it, because when we give people the illusion that when you're a great clinician, you catch it all, you always say the right things, you know, you're all knowing and all wise, right? It's a setup for people thinking that like they are so far from that. And the reality is human beings are complicated and we miss things many times. The hope is, you know, when we can see them again and try to either make it right with that person or in the future to learn from those experiences. I want to just name a concept I've got from my godmother, who's a womanist theologian, Renita Weems, and she talks about, yes, critical thinking Christians, right? And we talk about like the problems in the text, right? And some people who are not critical thinking Christians are not comfortable with you identifying the issues in the text, but that I can note issues in the text and still love God, right? I can note that now this right here, I don't know why that happened like that, or I don't agree with that, and yet that doesn't make us less of a Christian because we're willing to see the humanity and the challenges in the text. I wanted to say, this is the last thing I'll say. I'm sorry. I had multiple notes. The last thing I'll say is this issue about how we get challenged with our notions of who God is. And I was presenting at a trauma conference in San Diego, and a woman raised her hand and she said, I had a client who was raped and she was having challenges with her faith. And I really feel like I can't help her because I'm also a trauma survivor and I have challenges around faith. And so she wanted to know my response. So I said to her, in my opinion, doubt is evidence of growing faith. That when there is no doubt, there's just like memorization and recitation, right? My Sunday school teacher said this, and I'm repeating it back to you. But then life shows up. And when life shows up, now I have to try to make sense of what I believed and what I have lived. And in that grappling is when authentic faith is born. And she said something which I loved and I had never heard before. She said, I guess that's why Doubting Thomas has always been my favorite disciple. And I said, well, like, Thomas is nobody's favorite. Like, he's nobody. He's like the bad example. But here was the beautiful thing she said. She said, because he wasn't sure, but he kept showing up. Isn't that great?
All right, so I'm sorry we got time for one more. I'm going to go over here.
Today, while laying the foundations to your lecture, you said that there is personal trauma and interpersonal trauma. And you said that this is when your body does not matter and your needs don't matter. These lines struck me. Yesterday, you talked about holistic healing and wellness. Today, my questions will be at the crossroad of both days. Are there traumatized people in the monasteries? One of the vows that a Catholic priest has to take is the vow of chastity. Could we consider this trauma? Following Jesus Christ can lead us to trauma, can traumatize us. We are called to forsake a bunch of things that we would like to enjoy. I'm thinking about rehabilitation. Maybe after this time of consecration, they should be in rehab. What about heaven? Maybe heaven will be a place of rehabilitation.
Thank you. Thank you. Absolutely. So what we want to keep in mind is the distinction between choice and force. So God gave us free choice, right? So if I choose to fast, right, then, and this gets to my point on yesterday, it cannot only be a denial, but a filling, right? So then the body is hungry, but I'm feeding the spirit, right? Or if not, it is just pain and hunger. So one of the things that God really helped me with, and I think it's so important for those of you who are interested in being in helping professions, is God is not just a user. God does not just see you as a tool that he would like to use to help everybody else. But you, by yourself, you are beloved, that God desires to pour into you, not just so then you can bless someone, but no, stop, like full stop. God just desires to pour into you, right? And so sometimes in our works mentality, we're thinking I have to prove myself to God and to others by constantly pouring, and then we are not receiving. And some of us are not good at receiving, right? It's also a control issue. It's not actually God, it's control, where everybody come receive from me and I cannot receive. But God says, I called you, I love you, I choose you, I want to minister to you. Will you receive? So we do not have to, sometimes we are picking up crosses that are not our cross to bear.
Let's thank everyone on the panel today.